body has a certain bucket of energy to spend in a day. If you spend more energy than is available in that bucket, you will die. You will die because you don't have the energy to power the heart, the lungs, the liver, the brain, and so on. And so to stop you from spending energy, to prevent that happening, the brain gives you symptoms. Now, those symptoms have to be deeply unpleasant symptoms.
Because, these days seems like everyone's tired. What's actually behind that?
The number one cause of that is probably
Welcome to the 100 for Change podcast. I'm Niklas Gustafson, and over the last decades, I've been rebuilding health the way our ancestors lived, with food, movement, and what nature always knew. Today I'm joined by Dr. Sarah Myhill, a medical rebel with 4 decades of experience treating real people, not symptoms. She's helped thousands reclaim their health from long COVID, burnout, and chronic fatigue. She's published prize-winning books, original research on mitochondrial function, and has led medical freedom movements, challenging the system from within. And today she's here to share what the mainstream won't. Sarah, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you here.
pleasure is all mine, I'm sure.
Let's start with my favorite question. What does health mean to you, Sarah?
Health is all about living your life to its to the best quality and quantity that is possible. And health is not, we don't have a right to good health, we have to work at it. And as I say to all my patients, life is not a battle, it's a war. It's a war that we have to fight harder as we get older. It's a war we know we're going to lose. But if I lose that war when I'm 102, then I will settle for that. And the reason I say 102 is because I had an old boy living with me. He's been a friend of mine for some years. When he was 95, I thought, oh, Tony, you're starting to look a bit fragile. So I said, come and live in my granny flat. So I did all the things for Tony that I would do for myself: a paleo ketogenic diet, meat heavy, vitamins, minerals, and so on. And he died last October, aged 102.
Wow.
And when he died, he had no heart disease, no cancer, no depression, no dementia. He was not taking any prescription medications. He just lived his life to the full.
That's the way that I would like to end my life. So, when did you first realize that conventional medicine wasn't really helping people to get better, just keep them going?
The shameful thing is, within a few days of starting my work as a medical doctor in the early 1980s, because we had been trained as doctors, and when I say training, I should really rephrase that. It's not training, it's a brainwashing. It's a brainwashing on the pharmaceutical model, the drug model. And when I walked into my surgery, my patients were saying to me, why do I have headaches? Why do I have arthritis? Why am I so fatigued? And I didn't know the answers to that. And initially, my response was, let's do some blood tests. But that was only in order so I could buy time, so I could phone a friend, look it up in some books or whatever. So it was very early on in my medical career, through my patients asking the question why. And then, of course, many doctors who come into this style of medicine do so because they realise that conventional medicine is not addressing the particular medical problems that they have, or their families have, or their friends have. And my particular angle was I was allergic. And when my first, and I didn't know I had particular allergies, I just knew I had asthma, chronic rhinitis. When my daughter was born, she had the most awful colic imaginable. Of course, I was going to be the perfect mother, highly qualified, came out top of my year, knew it all. And and then when she was born, crying. And I can remember my then husband saying, "You're the effing doctor, you sort it out." And think to myself, yes, I am the effing doctor. Anyway, I gave up dairy products, and not only did her colic disappear, so did my chronic rhinitis and asthma.
Really?
And that was nowhere in the medical textbooks then, and it's nowhere in the medical textbooks now. It's absolutely shocking. It just illustrates the extent to which doctors are following the guidelines laid down by Big Pharma and not asking the question why. What is the mechanism of disease? That is the big question.
Yeah. So you're taking a lot of heat for challenging the system, right? What pushed you to keep going instead of just giving in?
Well, one of my favorite quotes is that I heard from Dr. Aseem Malhotra, which is that when you know the truth, you must let go of the consequences. And I couldn't practice in all conscience without doing that. And as a result of that, my colleagues and friends who have stuck with the conventional medical route, they cannot wait to retire. At the first opportunity, they want to give up medicine and go and live a nice, quiet, retired life. I don't. I'm still finding it exciting. I'm still enjoying my medicine. I don't think I shall ever retire. I have no intention of retiring because it's fun. Because the biggest kick, the most pleasurable thing that can happen is when somebody comes back to you and say, you've made me better. I've lost that symptom. I've got my energy back. My headaches are gone. My irritable bowel syndrome has melted away. And now I can get on with my life and get stuff done. That is the real joy of medicine. And doctors they don't realize what a privileged position they are in. They're in a huge position of privilege, and they abuse that privilege routinely by not working with their patients. And you might laugh when I say this, but I'm learning new things every single day, and I seem to be learning new things faster and faster than I ever have. I know I will never know it all, but the joy is learning new stuff and making progress and helping people.
Yeah, I agree. Learning new stuff is there's nothing better. So do you think medicine today is more about managing disease than restoring health?
Correct. And it's actually, as far as the prescribing doctors are concerned, it's all about making money for Big Pharma. Because Big Pharma controls medicine, its only responsibility is to its shareholders, and it has no responsibility towards patients. And the awful thing is, and this is why I had to leave the NHS in this country, the awful thing is that those doctors who think for themselves, who step outside nice guidelines, get sanctioned by the regulatory bodies. And the regulatory bodies are conflicted. They have vested interests in Big Pharma, as do government. And doctors get sucked into this system whereby they daren't step outside, the regulations guidelines, or they lose their job, which means they can't pay their mortgages, their kids can't go to school. And for some doctors, it's been a disaster for them. I was very fortunate because during the 80s and the 90s, I worked within the NHS. I was developing these ideas on allergy and diets and nutrition and detox regimes. So in parallel with that, I was slowly building up an independent practice. So that by 2000, I was able to jump and just work as an independent doctor. So that meant that when the General Medical Council came after me, not because any patient complained, I have to say, it meant that I was not in risk of losing my job, and therefore I could stand up to them, I could take them on, and I continue to do so to date.
So when you explain what you just talked about, it makes me think or question if the medical system even wants people to get well anymore.
I really don't think it does. I mean, when I went into independent practice, I thought that the doctors would be looking for this new information. Would love to hear that we can reverse pathology, we can cure patients, we can relieve symptoms through simple elimination diets, nutritional supplements, and detox regimes. And I set up a website. So, which is still runs today. So as I learn new information, I push it on the website. I write books. I'd love to put all my books on the website, but my publisher won't let me. And they would welcome that new knowledge. And I was astonished to find that they did not. Now, I have spent decades trying to talk to doctors and teach them with very, very little progress. So this is why I'm so pleased to do interviews with people like yourself, because this has got to be a grassroots revolution.
Right.
This has got to be a change of thinking at the grassroots where people realise that it is within their power to reverse their pathology. They can slow down their cancers, reverse their dementias, reverse their heart disease by dint of very, very simple interventions. And these should be available for all. So, I'm getting old and tired now these days, and I see my job as I need to give people, as I call it, the rules of the game and the tools of the trade so they can do it themselves. I need to empower people to do that. In fact, I've just been out in Poland. I did a conference out there, and there's a Polish saying that says, if you want if you want to count on anything, count on yourself, i.e., do it yourself. Work it out from first principles. Um, and put in place the interventions. And it's almost a kind of selection pressure because, as I'm sure you're aware, the problem that is facing the world today is overpopulation. It's an issue the politicians don't like to grasp. But what is happening in the modern world, the disastrous food supply, the increasing toxicity of the Western world, the declining level of micronutrients is a sort of selection pressure.
Yeah.
And those people who've got the intelligence to work it out and the discipline to put it in place, those people will survive. So I want to give these people, as many as I possibly can, the tools they need to allow them and their families to survive well into the future.
Sarah, I've heard you talk about mitochondrial dysfunction. And that's something very basic. Do you think it's still ignored in mainstream medicine?
Well, the astonishing thing is, when I was at medical school in the 1970s, we learned about mitochondria then and promptly forgot about it because apparently it had no clinical application. And the same is true today. I mean, mitochondria, which of course are the little engines in every cell in the body that generate energy, these are central to things like heart failure, to cancer and to dementia, but they're not even thought about or addressed or even looked at. I mean, it is a parlous state of affairs that the doctors themselves, barely know what mitochondria are, let alone what they do, and certainly have no idea how to improve mitochondrial function, because energy is central to everything, isn't it? Without energy, we have no life. In fact, I see all pathology that has two major drivers. The first driver is poor energy delivery mechanisms, and the second driver is inflammation. When the immune system is overacted, dysregulated, busy doing the wrong things. And if we can, and sometimes I see people with complex clinical pictures, and sometimes, and I can tell you 99 times out of 100, there is no single remedy to allow them to recover. It's always packages of treatments. And those packages of treatments directly address energy delivery mechanisms, of which mitochondria are central, and inflammation, because the immune system is so dysregulated. And by attention to those details, so often symptoms are settled down and pathology is reversed.
So would you say that chronic fatigue is less a medical condition and more of a symptom of modern living?
Chronic fatigue syndrome is the clinical picture we see when there are poor energy delivery mechanisms. And there's a multiplicity of reasons for that, which we can go through. ME is chronic fatigue syndrome and inflammation. And that inflammation may be driven by low-grade infection, or it may be driven by allergy and autoimmunity. But the starting point to treat both is always energy delivery mechanisms. And the analogy that I like to use, that I get, my patients get, is the car analogy. So guess what? For your car to go, you've got to have the right fuel in the tank. And that's all about diet and gut function. And then you need some oxygen, obviously, turn off the oxygen supply and you're going to be dead in minutes. And then, of course, the mitochondrial engine. And that mitochondrial engine, it takes fuel from the bloodstream, ideally in the form of ketones, burns it in the presence of oxygen to generate energy. And then we need the control mechanisms, and that pertains to the thyroid accelerator pedal and the adrenal gearbox. So all those 5 factors have got to be in place for good energy delivery mechanisms. And that applies not just to patients with chronic fatigue syndrome, it also applies to you and me. Because if you're going to live your life to its full potential, you're going to have good energy delivery mechanisms. And it also applies to top athletes. A good friend of mine, Peter Wilson, he won Olympic gold at the London Olympics 2012 in the double trap shot. And he says all athletes are looking for what he calls that fairy dust, that little bit of extra, je ne sais quoi, that will give them the edge and make the difference between a gold medal and also RAN. And if those athletes pay full attention to energy delivery mechanisms, they're going to have a much better chance of finding that fairy dust, as I call it, that will make the difference for them.
So could things like brain fog, depression, or pain actually be signals that the body's low on energy, and we're just not seeing it that way?
Of course. I mean, those are not diagnoses, they're clinical pictures. We have to ask the question why. And if you impair energy delivery to the brain, it's going to go slow, which means you can't think clearly, you can't multitask, poor short-term memory. And then, and when it comes to depression, that's a very interesting symptom, because the point here is that the body has a certain bucket of energy to spend in a day. Now, if you spend more energy than is available in that bucket, you will die. You will die because you don't have the energy to power the heart, the lungs, the liver, the brain, and so on. And so to stop you from spending energy, to prevent that happening, the brain gives you symptoms. Now, those symptoms have to be deeply unpleasant symptoms. If they're not deeply unpleasant symptoms, you will go on spending energy until you die. And the symptoms are obviously fatigue. People feel profoundly fatigued. The brain, it stops working. But in addition to that, the brain gives us symptoms to stop us spending energy. And one of those symptoms is depression. So depression occurs. And of course, when somebody is depressed, they don't want to socialize. They don't want to get out and do things. They just want to lie in bed. That stops you spending energy. And so my treatment of somebody with depression would be to improve energy delivery mechanisms. And then, yes, of course, they need the stimulus. We all need a project. We all need a horizon. We all need a hobby. We all need something that piques us and grasps our fancy that we want to go for. Yeah. So depression is extraordinarily badly treated in this country by the psychiatrists, because all they do is give drugs, and those drugs are addictive. Now, addiction is another big issue. Because, as I mentioned, we have a certain bucket of energy. And as we spend energy, that energy gap gets narrower. Now, what addictions do is they mask those symptoms. Yeah. They mask those symptoms of fatigue. So coffee, maybe alcohol, cigarettes, they give us a sense of false energy. And the psychiatrists do the same with the drugs. The drugs give us a sense of false energy. But worse than that, they stop us from caring. They render us emotionally numb. And those drugs are just another addiction added on to the social addictions that we already have. And so, of course, there's no hope of cure for those patients. They just spiral downhill. But if you address their problem from an energy perspective, then you have a very good chance of affecting a real cure.
Yeah. Because, I mean, these days seems like everyone's tired and, even exhausted. What's actually behind that? Is it poor sleep? Is it bad food? Or maybe a combination? What would you say?
It's the combination. As I say, it's either the wrong fuel in the tank, or it's poor mitochondrial function, or it's poor thyroid function, or poor adrenal function, or whatever. So you're right, fatigue is very common. And I think the number one cause of that is probably diet. In fact, I always start off with any patient addressing diet. And when the question comes up, well, what diet should I do? Always go, in fact, when any question like that comes up, always go back to evolutionary biology, because we evolved over hundreds of thousands, millions of years eating a paleo ketogenic diet. That is the diet uniquely suited that our bodies have evolved to function at its best. And that diet was low in sugars and carbohydrates. There were certainly no ultra-processed foods. Sugar would have been the very occasional treat in the autumn, but certainly not, present in our diets, day in, day out. It would have been devoid of dairy products. Dairy products are a very recent addition to our diet. It would have been pretty much devoid of gluten grains. Again, wheat, barley is a recent, rye is a relatively recent addition to our diet, and gluten grains alone can cause fatigue. So that's always the starting point. In fact, increasingly these days, I think, I'm starting people off with a carnivore diet. I think a carnivore diet is the most frictionless route to recovery. And the carnivore diet is a very good diet for at least 3 reasons. The first reason is it's low in allergen. I mean, you can be allergic to meat, but it's unusual. And allergies are common. Allergy UK reckon about 40% of the population have allergies, and that drives inflammation. And inflammation, as I call it, kicks a hole in the energy bucket. The second reason is it treats the upper fermenting gut. Now, the upper fermenting gut is a major and common problem. So the gut is a tube which starts in the mouth and ends at the anus. It's about 30 foot long. The first 25 foot of the gut should be near sterile. It's never completely sterile, but a very low microbial load. The microbiome, where all the microbes are, is just the last 5 foot of gut. Now, the gut is a sterile gut. It's maintained sterile because we have an acid stomach, and that is perfect for the digestion of meat and fat. They're rapidly broken down in the gut, and that nourishes us very efficiently. Now, problems arise when we overwhelm the ability of the gut to remain sterile by eating large amounts of fermentable foods, sugars, carbohydrates, ultra-processed foods. And those foods make us hungry, so we tend to eat all the time. We're never fasting. So people are eating all the time, a high carbohydrate diet. Eventually, they overwhelm the ability of the stomach to remain sterile, and those foods start to ferment. They get fermented by bacteria. They get fermented by yeast, and that causes a whole host of problems. The first thing is that those foods, instead of being digested and absorbed, they are fermented to toxic substances. Toxic substances like ethyl alcohol, protyl alcohol, butyl alcohol, ammoniacal compounds, hydrogen sulfide, D-lactate, all these things, which poison us. Now, we do have a liver that helps to detoxify those things, but that is hugely demanding of energy and, of course, raw materials. So just to illustrate that point, at rest, the brain weighs 2% of body weight, maybe consumes 20% of all the energy generated in the body, the heart 7%. The liver can consume up to 27% of all the energy generated in the body, and much of that goes into detoxification. So that's a real problem. The other issue is that the microbes themselves produce toxins, bacterial endotoxin, fungal mycotoxin, which can poison us. And then those microbes that are fermenting in the gut, they live on the lining of the gut wall. That means the gut will become slightly inflamed. If you've got a slightly inflamed gut wall, you've got a leaky gut. And there's potential for those microbes to get into the systemic bloodstream and get stuck at distal sites where they drive inflammation. And I think a huge amount of Western pathology is allergy to microbes from the upper fermenting gut. So examples of this is arthritis. In fact, it's very well proven that arthritis is driven by allergy to microbes from the upper fermenting gut. Alan Ebringer, Middlesex Hospital, 1970s, demonstrated that ankylosing spondylitis is allergy to Klebsiella bacteria. He also hypothesized that rheumatoid arthritis is allergy to Proteus mirabilis. But I suspect that a huge amount of pathology, like polymyalgia rheumatica, temporal arteritis, fibromyalgia, intrinsic asthma, urticaria, inflammatory bowel disease, irritable bladders, nephritis. This is all driven by allergy to microbes from the upper fermenting gut. So it's a priority to get that sorted out. And this is where the carnivore diet is so good, because fat cannot be fermented by bacteria and yeast. Protein, only if there's a bit of carbohydrate there, will that get fermented. So carnivore diet helps to abolish the upper fermenting gut. And the third issue here is it's a low toxin diet. You see, if you look at life from the point of view of a plant, it doesn't want to be eaten. Now, plants can't run away from predators. They're sitting there. They don't want to be attacked by bacteria, viruses, and yeast. And so plants are full of toxins, glycosides, oxalates, phytates, tannins, phytoestrogens, and these are all toxic to us. Now, of course, we can eat plants, we do eat plants, but eating those safely is predicated on having good liver function, and having good liver function is predicated on having good energy delivery mechanisms. So again, a carnivore diet reduces the toxic load on the liver, and so the liver has to do less work. If the liver has to do less work, then we've got more energy to spend on other things.
Right.
So a carnivore diet for many is the quickest and most frictionless route to recovery. Most people end up on what I call a modified carnivore diet. So they have meat heavy with meat, fish, eggs, and then a few salads, a few green vegetables, maybe a few occasional fruits. So that is going to be the diet that's going to serve us best. And of course, in addition to that, we're not just poisoned by plant toxins, we're poisoned by human toxins. And I think the number one nasty is glyphosate. Glyphosate is a pesticide that is sprayed pretty much on all crops in higher doses. Stephanie Seneff, author of Toxic Legacy, reckons that every American is consuming approximately 1 gram of glyphosate a day. Now, that is not a trace amount. That is a therapeutic dose. Yep. If I prescribed a drug for somebody, I'm giving milligrams or maybe micrograms. So we're using large amounts of glyphosate, which of course we absorb. It's an organophosphate. The mechanism by which we make energy is called oxidative phosphorylation, and organophosphates inhibit oxidative phosphorylation, as well as being a known mutagen, carcinogen. It causes a multiplicity of problems. So I think the single most important thing is diet and food. In fact, I read a fascinating article the other day about what happened in the 1980s. Now, cigarette companies, of course, dominated then. They were the big money earners. And in order to get people to smoke more, the cigarette companies employed hundreds of scientists to work on how to make cigarettes more addictive. And they achieved that by adding extra nicotine, adding extra sugar to make those cigarettes more addictive. Now, when the anti-smoking ban came along, they realized their days were numbered. And so the cigarette companies bought up many of the food companies, and then they directed their scientists to turn their attention to food to see how they could make food more addictive. And those scientists realized they could make food more addictive by manipulating in such a way to get it just the right level of sweetness, fattiness, texture, or whatever. So it feels good in the mouth. We call it ultra-processed food, but it might feel good in the mouth and think, oh yes, that's delicious. It's addictive, but the gut hormones are not fooled. The gut hormones know that it's
so we
it's
keep
not good
eating.
food.
We're not satisfied.
Correct. It's not satisfying food. It just makes people hungrier. I mean, I've just been in Poland with a conference there, and I came back and just looking at what people were eating at the airport, just looking at what they're eating on the plane. And again, recent conference, the Public Health Collaboration in Solihull, I was speaking at, Dr. David Unwin, who's an NHS GP, who specialises in treating diabetes. In fact, he just in his general practice alone, he has reversed 135 cases of diabetes simply through diet. He points out that in UK today, children get 75% of their calories from ultra-processed foods. Teenagers get 86% of their calories from ultra-processed foods. That is a national crime.
Yeah, that's crazy.
We are destroying the health of our children simply through appalling diets.
Yeah, I think I read somewhere that the Paleolithics got 20% of their calories from carbs, and today it's like 80 to 90% from carbs. And the ultra processed food is basically is based on carbs and seed oils, right?
Of course. And the other point about paleo keto, yes, and they might have got 20% from carbohydrates, but not all year round. There's been a window of time in the autumn when there was a windfall, and yes, they would
fruits
have
and berries.
They would have more carbohydrates. It would have switched on the carbohydrate addiction gene, so they've eaten and got fat, and that's survival value for the winter. But they would have had long windows of time when they were purely carnivore, hunting or hibernating, or maybe even fasting. And that's when the body heals and repairs. We switch on autophagy, and that protects us from cancer and from dementia and from heart disease. So yeah, even that 20% was not all year round. That would have been in the autumn largely.
So yeah, that modified carnivore diet or animal-based diet, that's the diet I've been following myself for the last 15 years or so. I love it. I would never go back to having that oatmeal in the morning, for example.
Now, do you know, I can tell what people's problems are with their food just by asking them about breakfast.
I think I lost you for a second.
I don't have to take a full dietary history. Just what do you have for breakfast? And if it's, as you say, carbohydrates, cereals, fruit juice, then you know that they're in trouble.
So do you think that there are habits or hidden stressors in a modern life that quietly sabotage how much we make or use energy every day?
Well, yes, of course. As I say, it's all about diet and addiction, but it's as I say, the central player in mitochondria. And mitochondria can go slow because they have the wrong fuel in the tank, which we've touched upon. That's the carnivore diet.
Yeah.
But they can also
Yeah.
go slow because they are poisoned by something. They are blocked by something. And the fact of the matter is, we live in a toxic world and we are all poisoned. Now, we know what those poisons are because during the 2000s, I worked very closely with a wonderful biochemist called Dr. John McLaren Howard, and he was able to identify many of the poisons that are stuck on mitochondria. And I was doing tests like translocated protein studies and also fat biopsies. Fat biopsies, very easy test to do. Just stick a needle in, withdraw the needle, and the fat contained within the bore is sufficient for analysis. And the fact of the matter is, I never saw a normal result. We all carry a toxic load without exception. So detoxing is a centrally important part of staying well. And because we are all poisoned, we all need to do the detox regimes. Now, so the first thing is, well, we try to avoid being poisoned. And number one, dare I say it, is the upper fermenting gut. So we've cured that, haven't we, because we're eating a carnivore diet. Number two is probably pesticides and chemicals, and we can reduce the load, again, by consuming a carnivore diet. Ideally get meat that's grass-fed, because that's going to have a far lower load of pesticides than the meat that's otherwise. The most problem foods are the intensively reared pigs and chickens in sheds, receiving high rations of grain, which is almost certainly GM and almost certainly sprayed. So the bottom line is, the patients that I see with fatigue syndromes, very often they're unable to work. They can't afford expensive regimes. So we have to do something that is cheap and inexpensive and can be easily included in their life. So as far as the liver is concerned, because that's a major detox organ, yes, of course it needs energy, but it also needs a few raw materials. So like vitamins, like minerals, like essential fatty acids. So I like all my patients to take a good, simple package, a good multivitamin, some minerals, and some essential fatty acids. Fish oil is a great one. But we then have a group of chemicals which get stuck in our fat. And if they get stuck in our fat, and we know that because the sort of fat biopsies are always abnormal, they're not getting at the liver. So the liver can't access them in order to be able to detoxify them. So we have to mobilize them from fat. And I do that in two ways. First of all, heating regimes. Because if you get hot, and it doesn't matter how you get hot, if you're fit enough to go running, or saunas, or sunbathing, or hot bath or a hot shower, that literally warms up the subcutaneous flesh and mobilizes those toxins onto the lipid layer on the surface of the skin, from whence they can be washed off. And that process can be greatly improved by putting clean organic oils on your skin. I've put together a detox cream, which is a mixture of organic coconut oil, organic shea butter, with some vitamin C and vitamin D blended in. But you don't need that. Any clean oil will do. It could be olive oil. In fact, when I go to Paris to see my daughter, a great joy is to go to the Hammam in Paris. And it's a lovely sauna, and they provide you with this lovely green oil that you put on your skin, and that's going to facilitate any detoxification because it's an oil and also slightly soapy. So you put it on your skin, you mobilize the toxins into the lipid layer on the surface, and then you wash them off in the shower, and then you get hot again. And I know this works. There's some very good studies showing this work, particularly one produced by Dr. William Ray. Now, his is an interesting story because he was a cardiothoracic surgeon in the 1960s and the 1970s. In the 1960s and 1970s, the main anaesthetics we used were gases. And, of course, if he's operating on somebody's chest, he was inhaling those gases. He was poisoned by those anaesthetic gases, and he developed multiple chemical sensitivity. And that meant he was unable to work in the operating theatres. He set up the Dallas Environmental Center for Environmental Medicine in Texas in USA. And he did a study where he had 210 patients who had been similarly poisoned by chemicals. One of the symptoms of being poisoned by chemicals is you develop multiple chemical sensitivity. And what that means is you start to get allergic reactions to tiny exposures to those chemicals. Anybody, for example, who can't stand the smell of perfumes or air fresheners or such sprays, they have multiple chemical sensitivity. And part of the treatment of that is to reduce exposure through reducing your own endogenous toxic load. So he set up a study, 210 patients, where he put them through heating regimes, massage regimes, followed by washing off with soap and water. And he recycled them, heating, massage, washing off, as many as they could tolerate. He was doing blood tests before and after. One of the comments that his masseurs used to make is that often when they're massaging the body, they're suddenly aware of the smell of a chemical, of a petrol fume or maybe a perfume or whatever emanating from the site they're massaging. So you can see how it's biologically plausible they were physically mobilizing these chemicals from the skin. And what he demonstrated is that, yes, the toxic load came down reliably well. Now, one of the really fascinating aspects of that study is that of the 210 patients, 200 initially got worse. Now, that makes perfect sense because if you're mobilizing chemicals from fat, they're going into the bloodstream.
Exactly.
If they're going to the bloodstream, they're going to be poisoning the brain, poisoning the rest of the body. So an effective regime is often accompanied by worsening at first. Then they got better. 69% greatly reduced their chemical sensitivity. Now, I repeated that study, not with so many numbers, but just simply by collecting data before and after doing such heating regimes. And say it doesn't matter what the heating regime is. It doesn't matter if it's sunbathing, sauning, running, if you've got the energy. And in every single case, using fat biopsies, the toxic load came down. So these days, I don't want my patients to spend money on expensive tests. I want my patients to spend their money on the best organic food they can possibly get, because we know these interventions work. We know we're all poisoned. We know we should all do that.
Yeah.
Now, in parallel with that, there's another group of poisons which are a problem because they don't get to the liver because they're stuck in our tissues. They're stuck in our heart, in our kidneys, in our bone, in our brain. And those are the heavy metals. So heavy metals, we're increasingly exposed to them. I have never seen a normal test. And we get those out with chelation therapy. Now, the chelator I've been using for decades is DMSA, works very well. But I've recently become aware of how efficiently methyl sulfonyl methane chelates out heavy metals. And I've had a few patients who've been on DMSA, and then having gone back to use MSM, when we repeated their tests, we get further spikes of metals which DMSA didn't take out. And the two important ones that MSM is pulling out, one is aluminium. Now, that's really important because we're all exposed to aluminium. Anybody who's vaccinated will be poisoned with aluminium. And I'm so pleased to see that MSM pulls out aluminium, because hitherto we were led to understand from Professor Chris Exley, who his nickname is Mr. Aluminium because he knows so much about the metal. He maintained that organic silica was the only method by which we could remove aluminium. But organic silica is very expensive. Most of my patients can't afford that, but MSM is very affordable. And the other metal that I'm seeing being taken out by MSM, in addition to mercury and lead and arsenic, is gadolinium. Now, gadolinium is beloved by the doctors and the radiographers. Gadolinium is often used to scan hearts or scan the body looking for other such lesions. But it's a heavy metal. It's a toxic metal. It gets stuck in the body. And after people have had gadolinium scans, we want to get rid of the gadolinium. And this young man, there's one young man in particular, his name is Frank. Yes, I can use his name with his permission. And he had a gadolinium scan years prior, but he had a great spike of it come out in his urine when we gave him MSM. And the joy of MSM, it's organic sulfur. We're all sulfur deficient. It's also very good for the gut. In the upper gut, it kills microbes, the upper fermenting gut. In the lower gut, it acts as a prebiotic and feeds the friendly aerobic bacteria. It improves the quality of four-phase water, so it's very good for our joints. It's anti-cancer. It's a good antioxidant. So it's fast becoming one of my favorite multitasking tools. We should all be taking MSM.
And how come we're all deficient in sulfur?
Probably because we're not eating enough meat. We evolved eating a carnivore diet. And that is going to be compounded by the fact that the sulfate pathway is a major detox pathway. So if we are poisoned by chemicals from the outside world, chemicals from plants, chemicals from the upper fermenting gut, then we're going to be depleting sulfur in order to get rid of those chemicals. So, and these are not my words, these are the words of Stephanie Seneff, wonderful biochemist from America who wrote a book, A Toxic Legacy. So sulfur deficiency is very common, if not universal.
Okay, so you mentioned MSM. And what other supplements would you recommend for people that follow the normal Western diet, the highly processed diet? What other supplements would you recommend?
Well, as I've mentioned, a good multivitamin, a good multimineral that has all the minerals in decent doses. But we should all be taking vitamin D. We are all vitamin D deficient without exception. And again, what's the dose? Go back to evolutionary biology. Primitive woman was getting 12 hours a day exposed to sunshine. I recommend vitamin D 10,000 IU, which is equivalent to about half an hour or an hour's sunshine. It is also the NOAEL, the No Observed Adverse Effects limit. And we know that vitamin D is highly protective against heart disease, highly protective against cancer. It's highly protective against COVID. In fact, fascinating study done in this country by the NHS. Vitamin D levels were measured in patients who came to hospital with COVID. If the vitamin D level was lower than 25 picomoles per litre, the death rate was over 95%. If the vitamin D level was above 75, the death rate was less than 5%. Now, if you extend that line, that inverse correlation down to the horizontal axis, you find that if you're running a vitamin D of about 125, the death rate is effectively zero. So vitamin D is so important. Now, you then have to ask the question, what's the reason for that? The point here is if somebody gets COVID, the COVID virus doesn't kill you. It's the body's immune reaction against the COVID virus that kills you, and that is called the cytokine storm. That is a pro-inflammatory drive, and vitamin D is one of the most important anti-inflammatories in the body. It prevents that COVID storm getting out of hand, that cytokine storm getting out of hand. The other supplement I love all my patients to take is vitamin C, and my recommendations will be for 5 grams a day. Now, I get that dose from Linus Pauling. Linus Pauling, very clever man, won 2 Nobel Prizes in his own right, and he was only beaten to a third by Watson and Crick. He spent the last third of his life concentrating on the study of vitamin C. And he makes a very, very simple point. It's humans, fruit bats, and guinea pigs that lost their ability to make vitamin C some millions of years ago. And if you work out from goats how much they make, from dogs how much they make endogenously, from horses, and you transfer that to humans, we should be synthesizing about 5 grams a day for optimal biochemical function. So guess what? We're intelligent. We can make it. So I just recommend that we should all be taking 5 grams a day as a supplement for optimal biochemical health.
That's like a teaspoon, right? 5 grams.
Around a teaspoon of vitamin C. And ascorbic acid is very inexpensive. It dissolves very well in warm water. So stir it into a glass of water, slug it back with your supplements. Job's done for the day.
So why do you think humans actually lost that ability to make our own vitamin C?
That's a very, very good question.
If we look at it at an evolutionary perspective.
That's a very good question. And one theory that has to do with vitamin C is that it allowed us to store sugars more efficiently, so we got fat for the winter. I don't know if that's right or I don't know if it's wrong. The interesting thing about a carnivore diet is if you eat a proper carnivore diet with lots of offal, the vitamin C is very bioavailable. We don't become vitamin C depleted. Yeah. But I think there's a big issue here because the upper fermenting gut is very, very common. If you eat any amount of carbohydrate, you will have enough fermenting gut for a certain extent. And much vitamin C is used up in the business of dealing with that upper fermenting gut. But, it's a very good question. I don't know why we lost that ability. Why did guinea pigs lose it? Why did fruit bats lose it? Maybe they could get sufficient from their diet. But it strikes me as being a bit of an evolutionary error.
So liver, for example, is high in vitamin C.
Correct. So maybe, it became an unnecessary biochemical step because, I say, we could get it from food. And as you rightly point out,
we could get
liver
it, exactly.
is one of the most, nutritious foods that you can possibly consume.
You should start with lab testing, or are there supplements that are generally helpful even without blood work? Where would you start?
As I point out, my patients, generally speaking, are not wealthy because they're fatigue syndrome patients, they can't work. So my view is everybody, without exception, should take a basic package of nutritional supplements. A good multivitamin, a good multi-mineral. In fact, I make up my own multi-mineral that my patients have, which I call Sunshine Salt. And the reason I made it up is because I couldn't find a mineral preparation on the market that had all the minerals that I wanted to see in good doses, in a form that was soluble and could be absorbed, and in the right proportion. So there's a company that makes it up for me, and I try to keep the price as cheap as possible. And again, because everybody is deficient in vitamin B12, I put a big dose of vitamin B12 in there, 5 milligrams of methylcobalamin per daily dose. And again, because everybody is deficient in vitamin D, I put a good dose of vitamin D in there, 50,000 IU per daily dose. And both those vitamins are heat stable. So that's a very good start. And then we are all deficient in oils, particularly omega-3s. So we should all be eating fish. So I like everybody to eat oily fish at least 3 times a week. The acronym is SMASH IT: sardines, mackerel, anchovies, salmon and herring. And then I think we should all be taking some iodine because iodine deficiency is pandemic. And again, highly protective against infection. There is not a tissue in the body that doesn't need iodine. The heart for dysrhythmias, the immune system for effective immunity, the brain for intelligence, obviously the thyroid gland, and it helps us to detoxify. So again, I use Lugol's iodine, 15%, gradually build up to 2 or 3 drops daily.
So have you seen people go overboard with supplements, and what's the risk of doing too much or taking the wrong ones?
There was the Americans have studied side effects and deaths from supplements since the early 1980s. In America, there have been no deaths from nutritional supplements for the last 45 years. They are extraordinarily safe. Now, the reason that they are so safe and drugs are so dangerous has to do with our biochemistry. You see, we need our biochemistry to work, as I call it, in a frictionless way. So enzyme reactions to flow easily. The business of generating energy is all about electron and proton flows, electron gradients, proton gradients. And for those to happen in an efficient way, they need micronutrients, particularly coenzyme Q10, vitamin B3, acetyl L-carnitine. So nutritional supplements, I call it, reduce the friction in the system. They reduce the biochemical friction. And therefore, the more you take, or the greater the variety you take, the greater the chance of reducing that biochemical friction. But this is where drugs are completely different, because drugs work by blocking, by inhibiting enzyme systems. And they will inhibit them in unpredictable ways. So you might choose a drug because it inhibits that enzyme, but it could be inhibiting this, that, and the other as well. And then when people are on cocktails of drugs, they're blocking all sorts of different enzymes, and the whole thing becomes completely unpredictable. And the fact of the matter is, drug interactions, they might have tested the interaction between drug A and B, and A and C, and A and D, but they've never tested the interaction between A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. And the shocking thing is many people are on such cocktails of drugs. and the cumulative toxicity has never been studied. And of course, that's all going to be compounded by the chemicals we know are in our fat, that are in our the heavy metals that are in our tissues, which make the whole thing worse. And the liver simply cannot cope with this total load. I mean, the liver evolved to deal with natural toxins that are present in plants, and maybe a few toxins that came once a year when the autumn harvest came, and we had a window of time maybe when we did have an upper fermenting gut. So, gamma GT, for example, a liver enzyme, that evolved to deal with alcohol. If you sat down and ate a couple of pounds of grapes, and if you're a primitive man, you might well do that. If the grapes were there in abundance, then of course you would eat a couple of pounds of grapes. Temporarily, you would have an upper fermenting gut because the yeast on the surface of the grape would ferment the sugar within the grape, and you would produce alcohol. And gamma GT has evolved specifically to detoxify alcohol. But these biochemical pathways we have, these oxidation pathways, these sulfation, glucuridation, amino acid pathways that detoxify, they're not infinite. You can overwhelm them. And if they are overwhelmed by plant toxins, by products of the upper fermenting gut, by drugs, then you are going to increase the toxicity of all those things. There's a lovely study done by Rosemary Waring, biochemist at Birmingham, who looked at the detoxability of patients who had Parkinson's disease. She tested them with a drug that we no longer use called dibrizoquin. And what she showed is that those patients who had Parkinson's disease had much longer half-lives of this drug in their body. They were the slow detoxifiers. And that would explain, because Parkinson's we know can be caused by poisoning. We know it can be caused by organophosphate pesticides, for example. So looking after our livers and keeping the total load low on our livers and assisting our livers to detoxify with, guess what, with sulfate, with glutathione, with amino acids, with small amounts of sugar on the glucuridation pathway, is another essential part of us keeping well.
I really would like to hear your opinion on statins because they are everywhere. What worries you the most about how casually they are prescribed?
Okay, well, the problem about statins, and these are not my words, these are the words of consultant cardiologist Dr. Aseem Malhotra, who has studied this firsthand for himself and written a lovely book, A Statin-Free Life, is that the benefit of statins on extending life is almost zero. It's measured in a few days. And the problem with statins is they work because, they're said to have any effect because they reduce cholesterol. But the real problem is they inhibit the body's own production of coenzyme Q10. Now, coenzyme Q10 is essential for mitochondria to generate energy. It's one of the most important acceptors and donators of electrons in mitochondria. It massively reduces the biochemical friction in mitochondria. I think of coenzyme Q10 as the oil of our engines. And if you reduce coenzyme Q10 and you impair energy delivery mechanisms, then you are going to massively increase your risk of dementia, heart disease, and cancer. And statins do all three of those things. Now, if statins have any effect on the body, the interesting thing, they do have a mild effect on the body, but not because they reduce cholesterol. The fact of the matter is statins are mildly anti-inflammatory. And they're mildly anti-inflammatory because their clinical shape is very similar to vitamin D. So any possible benefit of statins can be entirely achieved by taking vitamin D. And then you don't need the statin, you get all the benefits of, and none of the problems with mitochondria. So yes, I think statins are at the top of my pet drug hates.
What about cholesterol? Is lowering cholesterol a good idea?
No,
is
it's a
taking
rotten
us
idea.
closer to optimal health?
Cholesterol is so important for our membrane structures, for our brains, for our immune system. I can show you any number of studies that show the higher your cholesterol, the longer you live. And of course, 80% of cholesterol is made in the liver, but we need to eat fat. It's such an important and maligned food. In fact, one of the problems with the carnivore diet is getting enough fat on board. People think it's lean steaks and lean meat. No, it isn't. It's fatty meat. I mean, the most precious food for primitive man was to eat a large vegetarian animals such as a bison or an elephant or a mastodon, because it's loaded with fat. It's a very fatty meat, which of course is delicious, and that would have fed the whole tribe for weeks. So the difficulty with carnivore diet is getting enough fat on board. So I'm very happy for people to use lots of butter. Butter is the only safe dairy product. It's rich in fat. Choose fatty meats. And again, with carnivore diets, I'm very happy for people to use maybe supplement with coconut oil, with olive oil, drizzle olive oil on their food. In fact, when I was in Romania recently, and they've got the most fantastic salami, which is pure fat. It's called lardo. It's made from the Margherita pigs, and it's cured and smoked, and it is absolutely exquisite. It just melts on the mouth. It's the most delicious thing you've ever consumed, and of course, it's pure fat. Now, we were told about this by a wonderful, the last Saxon of the village. And he described how this would be stored in the church towers, and the local people were not allowed to eat it until the first thunderstorm in the spring. Why was that? Because the first thunderstorm marked when the foods we needed to plant, when they needed to sow, when they needed to start the whole business of farming. Then they were allowed to eat the fat, because that powered these people through the day. It allowed them to work very long hours in the fields because they were eating fat, running on ketones, which means they were working very efficiently, and they had all the fuel that they need to work the long hours in order to farm and survive as they did so successfully.
What about fiber? We're constantly told to eat more fiber. Is that actually a good advice?
I'm not sure it is such good advice, I have to say. Fiber, we can ferment it to a certain extent to produce short-chain fatty acids or ketones, but it is intrinsically toxic. Now, people often say, "Oh, we need fiber to stop ourselves becoming constipated," but as many of the carnivore advocates say, and I think there's much truth in this, adding fiber for that reason is like adding cars to a traffic jam. You're just going to increase the traffic jam. And I think constipation is actually all about friction within the lining of the gut. Because, you think about it, if primitive man is trotting through the jungle, he's at risk of a predator jumping at him. He's at risk of somebody else attacking him. He can't afford to squat on the ground and be trying to push out, a primitive turd for minutes. It's a very dangerous thing to do. He needs to be able to squeeze that turd out very quickly. I mean, look at my horse. It doesn't even stop walking when she does a dropping. Same as my dog, squats down, drop, and gone again. So I think constipation is all about friction. And what renders the lining of the bowel frictionless is good quality mucus and good quality fourth phase water. Now, this I have to say is one of my favourite subjects. Fourth phase water, and this is work done by Gerald Pollack. Water we know exists in three phases. It exists as a liquid, and we call that water. It exists as a solid, and that's ice, and it exists as a steam, which is water vapor. But it also exists in another form, which is what water molecules do against a membrane, against a surface, any surface. Protein, lining of blood vessels, cells, mitochondria, and so on. And to cut a very long story short, it organizes itself into a honeycomb structure and makes that surface negatively charged. Now, if surfaces are negatively charged, they oppose each other. They can't stick together. And this is why I can wave my arms around like that. And it's frictionless. There's no kind of resistance there. It's frictionless because the surfaces are hovering over each other on negative opposed magnets. There's a railway system in China called maglev, where the trains hover over on a surface, and the trains can go at 1,000 kilometers an hour, massive speeds, because it's frictionless. And so it is in the gut. If we've got good quality fourth phase water, then the contents of the gut can pass through in a frictionless way. So we have to ask, what do we need for good quality fourth phase water? And one thing, we need lots of fat. Yes, we need good quality water. We need heat. We need to keep warm. But what greatly increases the quality of fourth phase water is sulfur groups. This is where MSM is so good. This is why meat is so important. So, the carnivore turd, it might not be, number 4 on the Bristol stool chart, but the carnivore turd is passed quickly and effortlessly without straining, and the carnivores do not get constipated as a result.
You mentioned a couple of times the paleo keto diet, and some people feel great on keto, and others they just crash. What do you think? Why do you think that is?
Okay, well, a very common cause of this is the underactive thyroid, and what you're describing is called ketogenic hypoglycemia. So people feel they haven't got the fuel in the tank, although they have. Now, the point here is that for us to be able to access fat, so I eat 2 meals a day. So I try to eat all my food within a 6-hour window. Some carnivores just have 1 meal a day. And so, yes, they'll obviously get calories from that food, but much of the time they are living on the fat that's stored in their body. And to be able to access that fat, we need thyroid hormones. We need thyroid hormones to access that fat, move it to the liver where it can convert into ketones, and ketones is the perfect fuel. Now, the underactive thyroid is very, very common and hugely underdiagnosed. So that ketogenic hypoglycemia, as I call it, is typical of the underactive thyroid, and often a very useful clue that that person has a problem. So at that point, I would want to investigate their thyroid, and that's not just a case of doing a blood test. We have to look at the clinical picture. We have to look at the clinical signs. Yes, blood tests are useful, because what the blood tests do is they tell us if there is a biochemical scope for a trial of thyroid. Because the point here is that all diagnosis is hypothesis. So we hypothesize that somebody has an underactive thyroid from the clinical picture, from the symptoms, from the signs, and from the blood tests. And then we give them a trial of thyroid and see how they feel. And very often they feel so much better, and then they work out for themselves, what is the sweet spot. And we can do this without a doctor. In fact, I've written a book about this. I've called it The Underactive Thyroid. Do it yourself because your doctor won't. And the shameful fact of the matter is that is the case, because doctors only look at blood tests. And if it's all in the normal range, oh, you're all right, you don't have an underactive thyroid, off you go. But it's a common problem. And Keith Braverman, who is an endocrinologist in America, wrote a book about this, reckons that probably about up to a third of Westerners have an underactive thyroid, many of them because they're iodine deficient. But I learned something really interesting just this weekend that I was in Poland. A lovely doctor who runs a Mitochondria company in Germany, called Dr. Hans Einsmann, and he is Dr. Franz Einsmann. He is 87, and there he was giving 2 lectures a day, coherent, brilliant, interesting. And he points out that to stimulate the pituitary gland with the stimulating hormones, you need energy, you need ATP. If you haven't got oxygen, if you haven't got vitamin C, if you haven't got ATP, the pituitary gland doesn't work. And this is so interesting to me, because in the people I see with fatigue syndromes, the commonest form of the underactive thyroid is not the thyroid's gone to sleep, it's that the pituitary gland's gone to sleep. And the pituitary gland's gone to sleep because the pituitary stimulating hormones cannot be synthesized without adequate levels of vitamin C, oxygen, and ATP. So the underactive thyroid is very common. So we start on low doses, build up. Anybody can access these food grade thyroid glandulars. In my book, there's a list of suppliers throughout the world. I've purchased food grade thyroid glandulars from all of them, tried them on myself, and they do contain active ingredients. And again, the key is start low, go slow. But you're absolutely right. Even having corrected the thyroid, I still have a few people who do struggle with a ketogenic diet. And for those, bringing a modest amount of carbohydrates is often helpful, especially before, if they're training or they're doing aerobic exercise, then to carb load is sometimes helpful. Now, if there's any doubt about am I doing the diet well enough, then a very useful addition is continuous glucose monitoring. Again, anybody can do this. You can buy the kits from Amazon. They cost about £60 for 2 weeks of continuous glucose monitoring. And what is going to be really helpful, it's not available yet, but David Unwin, who's a GP up in Southport, he is now working with Abbott Laboratories to produce a continuous ketone monitor. Now that's going to be helpful, so we can have the two together. And the reason why that's going to be so helpful is in the treatment of cancer, because the key point to prevent and treat cancers is diet. And those people have to be particularly strict about their diet, and they need to have a ratio of glucose to ketones of 2 or less. And the diet is much harder for them, and therefore when we have the continuous glucose and keto monitors, they will be so much better able to monitor their diet. So this is going to be a very helpful intervention to look forward to.
Sarah, this has been an exciting hour. I learned a lot talking to you. Thank you so much. Where can people find you if they want to learn more?
Well, on my website, just drmyhill.co.uk, I do online workshops that anybody can join in, and I talk all day. I've got one on Wednesday. And what is really good fun is I run weekend workshops at my home, and people come along on the Friday night. We eat a carnivore, paleo, ketogenic diet on the Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and we talk all weekend, and we sit in my summer house. I've got an eco pool, hot tub, sauna, so we can do some detoxing. And it's always a good fun weekend. Amazing. I really enjoy them. In fact, you must come. If you're coming to Bath, let me know, and you must come and join us.
I will. Next time I go to Bath to see my son, I'm gonna let you know. So we're gonna add a link to what you just mentioned, so people can sign up. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
It's been a pleasure.
You're an easy person to talk to because you ask all the right questions.
Thank you. Okay, talk to you soon.
Okay. Bye-bye then.
This was just one episode. There's so much more to discover. Check out the full podcast series, subscribe for future episodes, and let me know your thoughts in the comments.